I hope you go and look at Michelangelo's sculpted work, the famous David, which he did as a public commission, the famous Pietà, which he did for a church. Uh, and these are in your textbook, and I really recommend that you go and look at his early sculpted work before you begin the discussion. Um, but for, which is discussion 7 for module 7. But I wanted to show you just one work of art, and that is the Sistine ceiling. It was done for this Pope, Julius II, here shown in old age in a portrait by Raphael. Here is the Sistine Chapel. Some of you probably have known it. It's have seen this before. It is a little dirty. It has been cleaned, and this is an old image of it, but I did want to give you the overall arrangement. Remember back to our first work of art, the Scribeniu Chapel. This has an arrangement as well that corresponds to the Christian story. The life of Christ is here on the side walls. This was done by an earlier generation, before Middle Renaissance guys, including some that you've studied, Botticelli, for example. And the ceiling is actually chronologically post-dates, this painting, but but its subject predates. That is to say, this is the creation of the world up until the flood of Noah. So again, that predates the coming of Christ. And then there is this great wall, which is Christ coming again. So again, it's not just the Christian story given here, but all of Judaic time since the creation of the world, then encompassing again the Christian story, and then anticipating the end of time with Christ coming again. So that's how that works, and I think this is all familiar to you. But we're just interested in that ceiling, and again, to reiterate this idea that the main spine of the stories, the spine along here, we're laying flat on the floor and looking up, deal with starting, into thirds. The first 3 have to do with the creation of the world, and there's God creating the sun and the moon, for example. The middle 3 have to do with the creation of Adam and Eve, and the first sin. And then the last 3 have to do with the destruction of the world the first time with Noah and the flood. Some details here. Here again along the spine is, and they're alternating small and large, small and large, small and large. But God separating the light from the darkness, and then in a bigger scene, creating the sun and the moon. I love this slide. Seeing God twice, God the Father here, from the front, and then as he zooms away to go off and create the earth, we see him from the back. That's how Moses saw him from the back. He never got to see his face. I love that. The middle 3 scenes, we always think of this as the most famous, the most important, so we just suspect it's in the middle of the ceiling. It is, as you probably know, God creating Adam. But if I go, there's God creating Adam, and this is the sin, we'll see in a second. But really, the middle scene is God creating Eve. How about that? God creating Eve in the middle of the Sistine ceiling. And here it is, again, framed. I wanted to stop and just show you that, something you've probably known already, that all these scenes are surrounded with a flat wall. It's all flat, kind of like the Scribeniu Chapel or Mantegna's Camera Picta. I mean, they're all flat, but illusionistic architecture is placed up here, and then Michelangelo paints these figures as if they are sticking out in front of these paintings. But indeed, the entire wall is flat. If we were to run our hands across it, it is flat. So we put some nude figures around, some other figures down here we're going to talk about in a second. So again, the creation of Eve. This is the seminal story, the seminal narrative in the Sistine Chapel. We could go on about the significance of that for a long time, but I won't. And then again, in this kind of dual scene, We have the temptation of Adam and Eve, and then them being expelled from the garden. So the first sin. And because of that sin, and the building up, I guess, of that sin, the last three scenes have to do with the story of Noah. Noah, who is the one who is commanded to, build the ark so that when Christ destroys the wicked world, I'm sorry, not Christ, God the Father destroys the wicked world by flood, and all these people die, that Noah and his sons and their families will survive. So that is on the spine of the ceiling. Again, I wanted to talk a little bit about these subsidiary figures, not so much the nude figures who are kind of hard to interpret, but these ones, the ones that sit at the outer edge and that kind of connect us. Again, these ones that kind of sit at the outer edge and connect us to what will ultimately be the Christian story down below. They are male-female alternating. They are the prophets, the Old Testament prophets. You've seen that before, the Old Testament prophets who have some kind of inkling that Christ is going to come. And they are also the Sibyls. Now, the Sibyls are classical. They're ancient Roman ladies, mythological figures, I guess you might say, or literary figures. But in any event, they too were thought to have an inkling of Christ coming. So we've got both biblical and classical figures sort of there representing this idea that they connect the old world with the new world because they were able to see into the new Christian world. Here are some of the figures, again, the male figures. Now, Michelangelo, there's stories about how he worked, who he worked with, what kind of apprentices, and ultimately he did tend to get rid of apprentices and work alone. But initially, his figures are very tame. They sit in the illusionistic architecture very well, and then as he moves down the ceiling, they get bigger and bigger, and ultimately they just like explode out of their little seats. And again, these are the Old Testament prophets, the male figures, and they are labeled. This is Daniel, who is writing his book of Daniel. The ladies do the same. These are, again, my Sibyls. And, the earlier ones are very tame-ish. And then in the end, they just, as if they can't, their seats cannot contain them. Here's one more. And she's something. So lastly, after we've got the Old Testament scenes up here, the Old Testament and other prefiguring, other prophesizing figures here, I want to show you these guys. So these guys are really the most interesting one. They're called the ancestors of Christ. They're in these little lunettes and also in these little triangular pieces as well, pendimentums, and I'll just show you a few. The ancestors of Christ, who are mentioned actually in the book of Matthew, are those who come before Christ. They're born before Christ, so they don't know him, so that they're not able to be saved because Christ came when he came. He saved humankind from their sin, and so they're not able to be saved, so they sit in the shadows. They're good people, but they sit in the shadows and they wait. And so these figures are here, and they're usually families, and they're bored out of their mind. They're like people sitting at a bus station or something, train station, just like, here's another guy. Oh my gosh, I just love these figures. And again, they occupy this space here. When Christ come, he will and after his death, he will go and also save these people who deserve salvation. And even but they sit there kind of in limbo. And again, the story of Christ continues by other painters below this ceiling. So Michelangelo loved the twisted figure. He loved the overly muscled figure. He didn't care much for the rules of the Middle Renaissance, the idea of proportion or well-proportioned bodies, or even necessarily of, and you can see that in a variety of places, or necessarily of proper shading, proper modeling. He would often use bright color to model with. Let me find an example of that. Well, right here. So instead of using, white and black to model, he uses yellow, or he puts purple in a garment of yellow. He certainly was not interested in linear perspective or even in giving much context to figures. So in some ways he breaks from the Middle Renaissance in really significant ways. And in that sense he is just so different from Raphael. So Raphael, and I'm talking about early Raphael, Raphael died young, but he had he progressed quite a bit. But Raphael's early style is, pretty much just an extension of the Middle Renaissance. All the rules of proportion and shadowing and creating aerial perspective. These are the tools that Raphael uses to create his great works of art. This is another Raphael, a Madonna and Child, just so lovely, just so sweet. Whereas Michelangelo, tackling the same kind of subject, again, breaking all the rules. So you've got a Madonna who's, sitting in these contorted positions, overly muscled. You've got a really unclear sense of what's happening in the background. So even the subject matter is unclear. And again, these nude figures, are they angels? What are they? And then placed in a way where we can't logically understand their spatial relationship, the distance between the main figures and the background figures. So again, two very distinct kind of individuals here at the end of the Renaissance, but both of them achieving a kind of perfection or innovation or that signifies this third age.